At the bottom of the planet lies the continent of Antarctica, a place of endless tundra and icebergs, a permanent home to only the most enduring species of life, the only continent not owned by any country, and one of the last landmasses on Earth to be discovered. Often distorted on maps and forgotten, it remains as one of the last true frontiers on Earth. But what led explorers to venture to this land in the first place? Ancient Greek philosophers such as Aristotle hypothesized that a southern version of the already discovered Arctic must exist. The waters of the southern hemisphere were relatively unknown and unexplored. Indigenous New Zealanders may have been the first to sail into Antarctic waters in the 7th century. Famed explorer James Cook became the first to cross into the Antarctic Circle in 1773. However, he failed to reach land, but came upon deposits of rock floating in icebergs, suggesting that a cold southern land existed. There have been a few claims of who was really the first to sight Antarctica, but a Russian voyage in 1820 under command of Captain Fabian Gottlieb von Bellinghausen is most widely regarded as the first to catch sight of the Antarctic continent. Many sealing and whaling ships would come close to the continent in the 1800s, and it is very possible that one of those crews set foot on Antarctica first. However, the first confirmed landing of mainland Antarctica was made by American Mercator Cooper on January 26, 1853, on the east side of the continent. The dawn of the 20th century sparked a new interest in Antarctic exploration. A Belgian expedition would be the first of the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration. More and more people would reach the continent and desire to push further. A race to reach the South Pole had begun. British Navy officer and explorer Robert Falcon Scott was determined to be the first man to reach the 90 degrees south marker. In 1904, Scott had previously led the Discovery expedition where he set a new record of 82 degrees south. He traversed the Ross Ice Shelf and discovered the polar plateau where the South Pole laid upon. A few years later, in 1907, a member of Scott's party, Ernest Shackleton, headed an expedition that would ascend the formidable Beardmore Glacier, getting to within just 100 miles of the South Pole. In 1910, Scott planned his grand expedition to reach the southernmost point. Using a mix of ponies, motorized sleds, and straight manual hauling, he would set off from McMurdo Sound onto the Ross Ice Shelf in 1911. However, another contender had emerged as Norwegian Roald Amundsen would quietly take off from the Bay of Whales just a few days before Scott. He opted to use only dog sleds and would choose a different, untested, and potentially dangerous route. The experienced Amundsen would prove his method to be superior, reaching the South Pole on December 14, 1911, spelling victory for the team from Norway. The exhausted Scott team finally reached the pole on January 17, 1912, disheartenedly realizing that the Norwegians had beaten them by 5 weeks. The journey would not end well for Scott as he and his 4 party members would one by one succumb to Antarctica's unbearably cold conditions. He would make his last diary entry on March 16, 1912, reading, "I do not think I can write more. R. Scott, last entry." While the race to the South Pole had ended, there still remained other feats to be accomplished. The previously mentioned Irishman, Ernest Shackleton, launched the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914 to try to cross the entire continent through the South Pole. He planned to sail through the Weddell Sea and then cross the continent on foot to reach McMurdo Sound. Shackleton's ship, with the fitting name the Endurance, would depart from the South Sandwich Islands, south of Chile, in December of 1914, leaving the last bit of civilization behind. They would initially make good progress towards the continent, however, before they would reach land, the journey would quickly turn into a disaster. In January 1915, the Endurance would become lodged in ice in the Weddell Sea just off the coast of Antarctica. The crew would try for weeks to free the ship, but their efforts would prove meaningless as the thick ice would stretch for miles in any direction. They would then put their focus on rationing their supplies and hunting seals for meat. Crewmen would also busy themselves by building small igloos for themselves and their sled dog. As the Antarctic winter began in March of 1915, temperatures would fall even further to over 20 degrees below zero, and the days would shorten. The presence of a massive iceberg moving ever closer to the ship also caused uneasiness in the crew. members of the Endurance would continue their daily routine of looking for seals and cleaning the ship through the harsh winter months. As the sun began to rise again in September, the Endurance was not doing well. The ship had been trapped in the ice for over 8 months, and the pressure was slowly crushing it. The ship began to lean severely to its port side. The crew knew the end was near, salvaging supplies and lifeboats. Shackleton remarked about the toughness of the Endurance in his diary. "The end came at last at about 5 p.m. She was doomed. No ship built by human hands could have withstood the strain. I ordered all hands onto the floe, and as the floe near us was cracking, we started to sledge all the gear." Finally, on October 27th, the pressure of the ice floe sucked the Endurance into the icy water below. After the sinking, the crew had no other choice but to keep moving. Being on the unpredictable ice floes was dangerous, as they could break at any moment. They marched along the Antarctic Peninsula, setting up temporary camps along the way. After reaching the edge of the ocean, they waited for the right conditions to set their escape. The crew had brought along 3 lifeboats that they would try to use to sail for solid land. Waiting weeks for the right conditions, they would set their lifeboats afloat. Crewmate Thomas Otis Lee wrote in his diary of having to traverse through icebergs for days on end, writing about the daunting journey, saying that it must fill the most fearless with apprehension. Finally, on April 16, 1916, they would reach Elephant Island, 150 miles away from the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. All the men were seriously beaten down, and many suffered from frostbite. They had all been in the brutal Antarctic conditions for over a year and a half. After reflecting on their circumstances, Shackleton would make a proposal to sail to try to reach a whaling station on South Georgia Island to bring back a rescue party. It would be decided that he and 5 other crewmates would be the ones to attempt the escape. He would leave second in command Frank Wild in charge of those staying at camp. Packing 1 month of rations aboard the lifeboat, the James Caird, the 22 remaining crew members would say goodbye to Shackleton as he sailed for freedom on April 24th. As the 6 men sailed the 800-mile journey toward the island, trouble would ensue. The Scotia Sea, one of the harshest and most violent waters in the world, would unleash countless massive waves, almost capsizing the little lifeboat. The trip would last 17 long, grueling days when the crew finally reached the shores of South Georgia Island. The men would then relentlessly march over glaciers and mountains towards the whaling station through pain and hunger. The men at last made contact with the whalers, who would give them hospitality and organize a rescue effort. After 3 unsuccessful rescue attempts, in September 1916, Shackleton would finally succeed in reuniting with his crew. The 22 men left upon the island had been on the last of their food supplies, eating anything they could find. Upon Shackleton's approach, he shouted, "All well?" The head of camp, Frank Wild, would respond, "All safe, all well." At last, after almost 2 years in the unforgivable Antarctic terrain, the men would be sailed back to civilization and deemed heroes. And yet the most notable thing of all, and unlike many previous expeditions like Scott's, is that they did it without losing a single man to hunger, disease, or the cold. Their will remained strong, even during the most impossible circumstances. Now, what lied after Shackleton's journey? Shackleton himself would join the army and see some action in World War I. He would continue to explore the Antarctic up until his death and would make another expedition to the continent. Thus would mark the end of the great heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Some more feats would be accomplished, such as Vivian Fuchs and Edmund Hillary accomplishing the first overland crossing of Antarctica on snowcats in 1957. Shackleton's own ship, the Endurance, would be rediscovered in March of 2022. Now, why is the story of Antarctica so important? Maybe because it remains one of the harshest places on Earth. Maybe because it is one of the least explored places on Earth. Maybe because it is not owned by any country and reserved solely for scientific research. All of these things contribute to what makes Antarctica so unique and one of the last true